Hello, and welcome to the third lesson of the language and technology scheme of work. So, in this one, we're going to look at the history of technology and the impact upon language. So, this is quite a useful one, not only for language and the media, but also for topical language, for any coursework that might relate to kind of the impact that technology might have on our language. And also, it's a first real taste you have of language change, so looking at kind of language changing over time. So the statement on the board or on the PowerPoint says some methods should be thought on for ascertaining and fixing our language forever. It's better a language should not be wholly perfect than that it should be perpetually changing. Now, Jonathan Swift wrote that in 1712. So I'd like you to think, do you agree with Swift's view of language? Also consider, is the language perpetually changing? Now, perpetually means kind of constantly and kind of ongoing. If so, how does it change? And why do you think people are worried about language change? And I spend about 5 minutes or so answering those questions. So just a reminder, I think we've covered these before, but whenever we look at attitudes towards language and history, we always have to think about these two concepts here. So prescriptivism is focused on the right and wrong ways that language is used. It prescribes what is correct in terms of language use. Descriptivism is focused on the way language is used rather than the rules of language use itself. So if you're struggling to remember, some people do, prescriptivism prescribe the idea that a doctor prescribes drugs to you or medicines to you that you need to take, you will take them because it's prescribed. It's the correct way to do it. If you are studying language on an A-level course, though, chances are, we should be descriptivist in nature. We should be looking actually not what are the rules and what's right and what's wrong and, sort of standard forms. We should be focusing a bit more on the idea of actually, if language is used in a particular way, why is it being used in that way? So, I thought I'd define technology just before we started looking at how it impacts upon language. So it says here, technology means the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes, especially in industry. The reason I've defined it is because actually technology has been impacting upon language for many, many years. So just spend a minute or so having a bit of a look at the image on the left. What do you think is being depicted? And then what do you think the impact on the language this invention might have had and why? Okay, so this is Caxton's printing press, 1476. So Caxton, this isn't the first printing press, but it was a printing press that was brought over from Belgium, if I remember correctly. And basically, it made books easier to publish en masse. I don't know the exact technical way that it worked, but if I remember rightly, you were able to set up a whole page and print it. So rather than handwriting it, you were able to print it multiple times. Now, that meant that obviously, potentially, there becomes a wider audience for books. Now, as it says here, still often a learned audience. You have to remember at this time, education was not compulsory. It was only done really by people who were in the middle classes and the upper classes and people who had money. The compulsory need for education didn't really come around until the early 1900s. What did happen though is decisions need to be made. So Caxton, as you'll see when you do language change, he had to decide. Before he came up with the printing press, there were multiple ways of spelling the word eggs, for example. So he had to decide on the way that was best for him because it needed to be set up in terms of that when it came to using the press. Similarly, punctuation. If you're going to use a press, you need to make sure you had the right punctuation in place. Therefore, decisions had to be made. And similarly about the grammar that we used. As it says here, writers were still often white, middle class, and male. Women tending to be the homemakers and being, mothers, of course, at this point. And the purposes of writing could be different as the time taking to press a book became quicker. So you have this move towards stories for pleasure. Now, this didn't happen immediately, but what you had before the printing press was primarily books were being written about historical events, the classics, and religious kind of texts were being written. So you would eventually have a move towards a broader kind of genres of books that maybe weren't around before. So we've talked before when we look at context about purpose, audience, form and genre, producer and receiver, and these are primarily the things we look at. Just as another thing you might want to look at when it comes to looking specifically at the impact of technology on language over history is the four things at the bottom. So accessibility, cost, output, and conventions. So accessibility basically means how many people could realistically access this new technology. Cost sort of standard, whether it was expensive or cheap to utilize. Output, as in did it speed up the ability? So the printing press made it easier for books to be printed en masse, so suddenly there were more books. And then conventions, were there certain things that need to be put in place to make it so that this was the norm, things that we expect of communication? A bit like if you see a newspaper, the idea of the masthead, the headline, the picture. If you look at a book, the idea that there'll be chapters and paragraphs and things such as that. These are the 5 technologies we're going to look at in the lesson. So basically, I suggest you spend about 15 to 20 minutes doing this. So as you can see, I'll just spell out what they are. So you have the telephone in the top left, you've got mobile phones top right, you've got TV, you've got radio, and the bottom left one is the internet. All you need to do is spend, as I said, about 15 to 20 minutes thinking about what impact they might have had on our use of language. Consider both positives and negatives. It says here, think about purpose, audience, genre, accessibility, cost, output, and conventions. Also, consider the 5 language levels, so lexis, grammar, prosodics and phonology, discourse structure, and pragmatics, because there'll be different features of each that there might have been an impact on. Again, 15-20 minutes, 5 seconds on the video, and then I'll start to talk you way through them. So the phone, with each of these, I've tried to put the year that they were created and the main person who invented it. So the phone is 1876 and Alexander Graham Bell. Now, all of these pretty much have the same thing of lexis, conventions, and genres. What I mean by that is that every single invention that we're going to talk about brings with it new language, brings with it new kind of conventions and the ways that we kind of utilize the language in a standard way, and also genres in terms of the way, the types of communication that we have, possibly more apparent when we get to like the television and the radio. So the phone, in particular, the conventions that I talked about was the word hello as the way to start a conversation had to be agreed on. It wasn't necessarily the way we always started conversations. So suddenly we had like the way to start a conversation on the phone, we had the way to end a conversation on the phone, and other things that we do as we talk to each other. What it allowed was communication over distance. So if I had a phone and someone in Newcastle had a phone, we could communicate with each other in a way that we couldn't before. I mean, before we might send letters to each other, might send telegrams to each other, but we had immediate conversation. So you could argue that things like sort of small talk and kind of gossip and that kind of talking for no real meaning, almost phatic conversation, became a bit more prevalent. The idea of having communication with no sight is a great thing in some ways, but you could argue it leads to some of the issues we have with regards to not being aware that people are necessarily listening to you. The idea that you might try and multitask while you're talking on the phone and actually maybe not always taking in everything that's being said. The quality of the actual phone conversation itself, I'm guessing in the early days possibly were not the best, and even nowadays, if your phone network connection is not very good, it can be quite hard to understand what people are saying. Perhaps initially it would have been limited, of course, as well. So the idea being that not everyone would have had access to a phone, but over time people would, of course, and no non-verbal communication. So the idea that if you say something, sometimes the way we use our body language, the way we roll our eyes or lift our eyebrows or something like that gives away how we feel, and you have that communication with no non-verbals kind of working with it, which could lead to confusion. So the radio was 1896. It had multiple inventors. So there were a range of people who kind of came together at similar times with the radio. So as I said before, lexis, conventions, and genres. I mean, specifically genres here might be interesting to think about the idea of kind of soaps, like the idea of the sort of things that we have nowadays on TV, like your Neighbours and your EastEnders, would have probably come around first on radio and would have been a new sort of novel concept for them. The idea of jingles and adverts and all these other things that we didn't have before, that not only the lexis is added to our vocabulary, but also just kind of the sort of the things we expect to hear. At a time when not everyone would have been able to read and write, you also had access to current affairs in a way that you wouldn't have had it before. So the idea of the kind of news stories and news programs, if someone didn't have the ability to read, say, the newspaper, they could definitely listen and kind of keep abreast of situations that way. You could argue, and again, this kind of runs on to today, like the quality of output is debatable at times, obviously, depending on what you listen to, depending on who you can kind of trust in terms of the news that you're given, and also the veracity of the output. What I mean by that is the truthfulness of it. If you are listening to things, you've got to be very skeptical and kind of cautious sometimes about whether what you're hearing is necessarily the truth, whether there's bias, whether, we can always kind of believe what we are hearing. And we'll get the same with the TV and the internet, where we can always believe what we're hearing and believe what we're seeing. So the television was 1925, John Logie Baird. And again, so it'll go Lexis, conventions and genres. So again, there'll be different types of things in terms of the genres, perhaps of the show that we can see, the idea of, the sports program that, comes along, the clip show, the sketch show, various other things that perhaps we didn't have before. The main thing here is that it's multimodal, the idea that actually there are the coupling of image with words and language in terms of that way. So unlike the radio where you could just hear things, this was a mixture of the two things. So you can create different meanings based off of that. Both the TV and the radio were one-way communications, of course. You were not really interacting with it. You were passively accepting what was kind of coming in. You'd turn the channel on and you'd listen or watch. Obviously, that would change in time with things like the phone in and the radio phone in and the TV kind of phone in. But in their initial stages, at least, they were passive ways of communication. Again, you can question the quality, and especially, I guess, nowadays, if you're looking at some of the reality TV shows that are out there, people will question and query sort of to what extent that is good quality use of language. Similar to the radio, the idea that it will give access to information to people who maybe couldn't otherwise access information. But by this time, firstly, school was compulsory by the time this had come around, and actually by the time people had a television, because televisions were quite expensive for people during the early stages, most of those people probably would have access to learning in a way that would allow them to support their reading and their understanding at that point anyway. I've also said on my notes in particular, it says the idea that conversations with others, what TV and even, I guess, radio to some extent has allowed us is to have a bit of a type of conversation that we might have about the TV shows we watch. So therefore we will sit there and talk at lunchtimes and break times and, sort of at home with people about the TV shows. So it kind of broadens out the genres or types or reasons as to why we might converse with people. Also, the idea that we have now sort of TV on the move, effectively with your stuff like your Netflix and your Now TV and on-demand services, which allow us to access things from across the world, really. So therefore, I can watch a program that is from America, someone in America can watch a program from China, and there is this kind of move towards a more global media that perhaps wasn't there initially. So the mobile phone says here 1983 was when it became commercially available, the idea being that basically when it became sold rather than just being a thing. Martin Cooper was the person who came up with this. So mobile phones relatively, obviously this may be not the case at the start, were relatively cheap or are relatively cheap now. Most people in this country and across the world will have access to a mobile phone in some way, shape or form. It also broadens the distance. So before the phone, I could easily contact someone who was in the north of the country. Perhaps as things progressed, I could contact people from other countries as well. But the mobile phone allows you almost literally to be able to contact anyone at anywhere. It's multimodal, of course. So the idea that you can look at. Not only is it the idea of having words and images together, actually we can now send files. So you've got videos, you've got pictures, you've got all these other things that maybe you wouldn't have before. Word documents, PowerPoint slides, all these things that can be sent alongside text to create meaning. One of the weirder ones, I would say, is the fact that when we used to have the phone, and people use landlines less and less, I would say nowadays. When someone would phone you on the landline, the first thing you'd say is, "Hello, who is it?" or something along those lines. With address books and contact lists and ways of knowing who is contacting you on the mobile phone, the actual need to say hello to someone has kind of died off a little bit. Or you'll say hello, but you'll know who it is, so you won't necessarily need to request to know who they are. Or even if it's a friend that you really know quite well, you may even have a specific way of answering the phone, like calling them a nickname or even swearing at them potentially, if that's what you do. As always with these things, Lexis becomes a big shift, and one of the main ways that these things shift is that the apps that we use on phones become kind of the verbs that we use. So a good example of that would be to Skype someone or to WhatsApp someone. And another example of kind of how words change is the actual word text. So text used to be a noun. It was a thing, you'd send a text and that was what you did. Whilst now you'd go, oh, I'm going to go and text someone. So it becomes a verb. And that's a shift in the meaning and kind of the shift of the function, which functional shifts don't happen often, but technology kind of leads to more and more of these functional shifts. And finally, with the five inventions. So the internet was 1991. It existed before, but this is kind of the www style web that we know. And Tim Berners-Lee was the inventor. Now, largely the same as the phone. That's primarily because, or the mobile phone that is, that's primarily because the mobile phone now is multi-purpose. You can access the internet, so it's hard to separate the two things. What I will sort of flag up to you, though, is the idea that what the internet allowed you to do is create things like blogs and journals and self-publish books, and both non-fiction and fiction. What that means is, firstly, there's global access to anyone's writing pretty much in some ways. Therefore, the idea that you can easily access a blog that someone's written in America or Denmark or Brazil and read it just like you can read anything locally. What that also means, though, is that we can start to, again, question the quality and question the veracity. So, but firstly, it's easy to spread fake news, as we know. So it's easy sometimes to read things online that don't necessarily tally up with the realities of the life that we lead. Also, the quality. So if no one's editing things, so if I'm just putting stuff up onto a blog, for example, and I have lots of followers who perhaps don't understand, the sort of standard forms and the rules and the ways that we should utilize language, if I'm making lots of errors or spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes and people are reading them, that might have an influence on how they utilize language going forward, because there is no quality assurance in some ways. Doesn't mean that everything you read online necessarily is going to be like that, but it is worth bearing in mind. Primarily as well, it's sort of, with English, we start to have a move towards a much more homogenized way of reading and writing, because if everyone's accessing similar information across the world from the internet, some of the sort of more subtle nuances of our language possibly start to get lost. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's just something to bear in mind. It is happening, and that's why you might see someone from another country whose English is probably as good, if not better, than some people in this country, because they've either A, been taught it obviously at school, but B, they have access to TV shows, books, films that are spoken in English, and it's as a learning resource, it's great, but it kind of that's one of those things that sort of starts to shift a little bit in terms of how we utilize language. So to finish off the lesson, what I would suggest you do is basically take these five, and it just says here, which of these five inventions had the biggest impact upon the language in your opinion? Now, there is no right or wrong answer. It is up to you. You can decide based on what you've read and what you've heard, as to which one you think it is. But just, it's a nice way of kind of finishing off what we've done in terms of just kind of drawing things to a conclusion. Like, where was the biggest leap? Where was the biggest shift? Where was the biggest change? And it can be for for positives or negatives. It's completely up to you. Once you spent 5 minutes on this, again, as always, about 45 minutes to an hour, that's the lesson done. Hope this finds you all well, of course, and the next video will go up in the next couple of days. Any questions, obviously do email me. Otherwise, just stay safe.